South Asian program of pathways based at Brad University, and I'm also a member of NARIFOCO. And so the experience I'll be speaking of collaboration between the women's movement and the sex workers movement in Bangladesh is based on my experience of being a NARIFOCO member. But just thinking about it, I think that my work with pathways has also influenced the way that I'm looking back and sort of analyzing the work we've done. So I can see one feeding into the other. Now almost it's as if these two movements have come together. And when we speak of the contemporary women's movement in Bangladesh, I think the sex workers movement is very much a part of that. But it didn't happen automatically, so I'd like to take you back a bit to see, to show you how it got there. When the work started, at the beginning, in very early 90s, when one of the brothels near Dhaka was being threatened of eviction, in fact, it was the sex workers themselves who organized and mobilized the press. And they portrayed it as a right as citizens to have security from the state, to be recognized as workers. And that was the first time, in fact, the demands had come from them, had come out into the media. And so it was a challenge to the human rights movements, to the women's rights movements, to be confronted with a very articulate position, in fact, by the sex workers. There was a very good response also, I think, from the human rights movements and the women's rights movements to stand by them, which I think it was also a very strategic decision that this is a movement that has come from the sex workers. It isn't our role to come and take it over, but to have a supportive role. And even at that time, what was interesting is that they were articulating it in terms of citizens' rights, that we have the right to be protected by the state, not to be deprived of our livelihood, not to be forced to move from our homes and where we belong, in the brothels. And as part of the reaction, obviously there was the help in helping them have press conferences, help them negotiate with the police, help them negotiate with, because the force for their eviction was also cloaked in sort of religious terms, that they were anti-moral, the place had to be cleaned up, that they brought in the religious forces to sort of mobilize the community against them. So it was also cloaked in those terms. And what was done while continuing support to them was to also create for them spaces in the women's movement. At the beginning, all these organizations obviously weren't familiar with even the term of sex workers or sex workers' rights, but gradually saying that they are approaching us as women, wanting protection, wanting recognition of their rights. So let's see what they're talking about, let's see what they want, and gradually kind of creating a space where they could articulate their position, where they could talk about their problems. And it started with a number of workshops and places where various organizations that were willing to be supportive, but needed to understand better what the life was of the sex workers. Because, in fact, there had been a very strong divide with them, the sex workers considering themselves to be a totally excluded community, and the women's movement never having had to face this challenge. So there was a period of learning about each other. And I remember in those very first discussions, the term of sex worker wasn't used. It was still very much prostitutes, fallen women, disgraced women, and they referred to themselves in those terms. And when now you look at the media and when you hear them talking about themselves, they're now using the term of sex workers. So there's been a qualitative shift there as well. When the women's movement, there's been a tradition since about the 90s, the beginning of the 90s, of bringing out huge alliances to celebrate International Women's Day around various themes. So even making the sex workers a place in these national processions and in these national programs was saying that no, you also have a right to be there, to be seen and to be heard. After the early 90s, this movement sort of died down because there were leadership issues as well. Though there were some attempts to help create organizations of the sex workers, that hadn't taken off that well. But we sort of maintained informal contacts, irregular contacts, saying that we're here, if you want to talk to us, you can come and talk to us, but there wasn't that kind of response. It's only when there was another threat, and one of the older brothels near the capital, Kandapatti, was evicted, and there were threats on another brothel a little outside Dhaka, that the sex workers again realized that the importance of organization and being in touch with other organizations that would support them in protesting and trying to protect themselves. At that point, when there were in fact armed evictions, the police was called in, people were forcibly removed from the brothels to what they call rehabilitation centers or vagrant homes, and it was quite violent. At that point, there was quite a strong response from both human rights organizations, women's rights organizations, and the formation gradually of a committee called Solidarity. Because at that point, we found that these other organizations were